Mark Evans drums his weathered fingers against the steering wheel of his taxi, the rhythmic tapping almost lost beneath the gentle patter of rain against the windshield. The digital clock on his dashboard glows 11:43 p.m. Nearly midnight, the end of another grueling 16-hour shift. Outside, the city lights shimmer like jewels in puddles along the empty street. Mark's reflection stares back at him from the rearview mirror, deep creases around his eyes, salt and pepper stubble on his chin, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. 48 years old, but the past few years have aged him beyond. His years. The taxi, a 2008 Crown Victoria with over 340,000 miles on the odometer, groans as he shifts in his seat. The transmission has been slipping again, a problem he's been postponing fixing. The leather seats are cracked, patched together with duct tape that peels at the edges. The heater works sporadically, choosing tonight, one of the coldest of the season, to falter. Mark's gaze drifts to the small frame photo taped to his dashboard, his wife Sarah smiling with their two teenagers, Ellie and Jason. The image was taken 3 summers ago, before the medical bills started piling up, before Sarah's part-time job at the library was cut, before everything became a constant calculation of survival. He pulls out his phone, scrolling through the day's earnings. Tips have been meager, barely enough to cover gas. The mortgage payment is due next week, and Ellie needs new glasses. Jason's college applications will require fees they can't afford to spare. Every dollar matters, every minute on the clock. His potential income slipping away. His thumb hovers over the off-duty button on his taxi app. One tap, and he could head home, sink into bed beside Sarah, let sleep claim him for a few precious hours before starting again tomorrow. The temptation is almost overwhelming. A notification pings, jolting him from his thoughts. The screen illuminates with a ride request. Airport to West Side. Estimated fare, $42.50 plus tip. It's a solid fare, enough to make the difference between making rent and falling short again, but it means another hour of driving, another hour away from home, another hour fighting the heaviness in his eyelids. Rain streams down the windshield in rivulets, blurring the streetlights into hazy halos. The taxi's wipers squeak in protest with each swipe, another repair he's been putting off. The engine idles roughly, occasionally threatening to stall, a reminder that this vehicle, like its owner, is running on borrowed time. Through the rain-streaked window, Mark watches as other taxis cruise past, their off-duty signs illuminated. Younger drivers heading home to warm apartments or out to bars to unwind. The luxury of choice seems foreign to him now. He glances again at the photo of his family, at the smiles that fuel his persistence. The phone continues to ping, waiting for his response. Just one more, he whispers to himself, a mantra repeated countless nights before. Just one more fare. His finger hovers over the accept button as conflicting thoughts wage war in his mind. The promise of needed income versus the pull of exhaustion. Responsibility versus self-preservation. The eternal calculation of a man walking the tightrope of financial survival. Outside, the rain intensifies, drumming against the roof of his taxi like impatient fingers. The city waits, indifferent to his dilemma, while Mark Evans sits at the crossroads of necessity and fatigue, his next decision hanging in the balance like the last drop of fuel in an empty tank. Mark Evans turns the key to start his journey home, the engine coughing reluctantly to life. The wipers drag across the windshield, painting half-moons through the relentless downpour. His eyelids feel like sandpaper each time he blinks. A flash of movement catches his eye. Through the curtain of rain, a solitary figure stands beneath the dim glow of the airport's outer terminal lights. One arm raised in desperation, the other clutching a heavy duffel bag. The olive-green canvas unmistakable even through the storm. Military issue. Mark hesitates, his hand frozen on the gear shift. Home is calling. A siren song of warm sheets and blessed darkness. but something about the lone figure pulls at him. A silent plea that cuts through the storm. With a resigned sigh, Mark flicks his cab light on and pulls toward the curb. The passenger doesn't rush, moving with deliberate, measured steps as if conserving what little energy remains. Rain cascades down his broad shoulders, soaking through his simple grey t-shirt. The military duffel, worn at the edges, bearing patches and insignias half faded from years of service, swings heavily from his grip. The back door opens, bringing with it the scent of rain and exhaustion. "Thank you," the man says, his voice quiet yet carrying the weight of mountains. "Didn't think anyone would stop in this weather." Mark watches in the rearview mirror as the passenger settles into the back seat. Early 30s perhaps, but with eyes that have witnessed decades. His hair is cropped short, military regulation, and his posture remains ramrod straight, despite the obvious fatigue etched into every line of his face. "Where to?" Mark asks, already pulling away from the curb. "Pinewood Motel, if it's still there." The passenger glances out the window, droplets racing down the glass like tears. "Been a while since I've been back." Mark nods, recognizing the name of the modest establishment just 3 miles from the airport. A place where rooms rent by the week, where privacy is respected and questions aren't asked. The cab fills with silence, broken only by the rhythmic swish of wipers and the drumming of rain against metal. In the mirror, Mark observes his passenger's reflection, eyes fixed on the passing city lights, yet seeing something far beyond them. The man's hands rest atop the duffel bag, protective, fingers occasionally tightening around the strap as if anchoring himself to reality. They pass beneath streetlights that cast momentary golden glows across the passenger's face, revealing fleeting glimpses of stories untold, a thin scar tracing the jawline, calloused hands bearing the marks of labor and conflict. Dog tags partially visible beneath the collar of his shirt, glinting like secrets in the intermittent light. Neither speaks as they navigate the rain-slicked streets. The silence isn't uncomfortable. It's a shared understanding between two weary souls, each carrying their own invisible weight. At a red light, the passenger's gaze briefly meets Mark's in the mirror, a moment of unexpected connection. There's no smile, no nod of acknowledgement, just a look of profound tiredness that Mark recognizes all too well. The exhaustion that seeps beyond muscles and bones, that settles into the very core of one's being. The light changes, and Mark returns his attention to the road. The rain has begun to ease, the downpour softening to a gentle patter. Through gaps in the clouds, stars peek tentatively into the night sky, distant witnesses to the journey below. Mark's taxi continues through the glistening streets, carrying its silent cargo of untold stories. Two strangers, bound by nothing more than circumstance and the quiet dignity of those who shoulder their burdens without complaint, traveling together through the darkness toward uncertain destinations. The taxi rolled to a stop outside the Pinewood Motel, a single-story stretch of rooms with peeling paint and flickering vacancy sign. The neon cast an intermittent red glow across the passenger's features as he reached for the door handle. "That'll be $27.50, Mark said, his voice rough from hours of disuse. The passenger's hand froze mid-reach. A shadow crossed his face as he patted his pockets, first casually, then with increasing urgency. He checked his front pockets, back pockets, even unzipped a side compartment of his duffel. Confusion gave way to embarrassment, then to something deeper, a quiet desperation. "I'm sorry," he said, meeting Mark's eyes in the rearview mirror. "I thought I had cash, but—" The sentence hung unfinished between them. Rain tapped gently against the roof, counting seconds of uncomfortable silence. "I can go to an ATM," the passenger offered, though his eyes betrayed his exhaustion. "Or I can pay you tomorrow. I'm good for it, I swear." Mark glanced at the meter's glowing numbers, then back at the man's weary face. In that moment, he saw beyond the uniform, beyond the stoic demeanor. He saw someone who had likely given far more than he'd ever received. Without hesitation, Mark reached over and switched off the meter. "Don't worry about it," he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "Consider it a welcome home gift." The passenger stared, disbelief momentarily replacing exhaustion in his eyes. "I can't accept that," he said, his voice firm despite his fatigue. "You've got bills to pay too." Mark thought of his own struggles, the transmission that needed fixing, Ellie's glasses, Jason's college applications. For a moment, practicality whispered that he should insist on payment. $27.50 could be dinner for the family tomorrow, or gas for the morning shift. But looking at the soldier's face, a face that had witnessed things Mark could only imagine, he knew some debts ran deeper than money. "My dad was in Vietnam," Mark said quietly, surprising himself again. He rarely spoke of his father to anyone, let alone strangers. He always said the hardest part wasn't what happened over there. It was coming home to a country that didn't seem to care. The passenger's expression softened, understanding dawning in his eyes. "I care," Mark continued, his voice steady despite the emotion building in his chest. "So the ride's on me tonight." For the first time since entering the taxi, the passenger's composure wavered. His jaw tightened, eyes glistening briefly in the dim light before he blinked it away. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice barely audible above the rain. "But I won't forget it." He gathered his duffel bag and opened the door, pausing halfway out. The night air rushed in, cool and damp, carrying the scent of wet asphalt and new beginnings. Their eyes met one final time, an unspoken current of recognition passing between them. Two men struggling against different currents, but somehow sharing the same ocean. The passenger nodded once, a gesture containing more gratitude than words could express, then stepped out, into the night. Mark watched as he walked toward the motel office, duffel slung over his shoulder, posture straight despite the weight he carried. The rain had stopped completely now, and moonlight broke through the clouds, illuminating puddles that mirrored the stars above. As the passenger disappeared through the office door, Mark sat motionless behind the wheel. $27, and 50 cents poorer by the meter's calculation, yet somehow feeling richer than he had in years. Mark watched the needle hover just above the red line as he pulled away from the Pinewood Motel, the headlights cutting a lonely path through the darkness. His act of kindness, warm in the moment, now cooled in the face of reality. The digital clock on his dashboard read 1:17 a.m. The city had quieted, streets glistening with recent rain, empty except for the occasional truck or late-night reveler stumbling home. Traffic lights changed from red to green for no one, their rhythmic cycle continuing, regardless of who was there to witness it. Mark's thumb tapped nervously against the steering wheel as he calculated the night's earnings. Tips had been meager, fares inconsistent, and now he'd given away nearly $30 that could have filled his gas tank or contributed to Ellie's glasses fund. The weight of financial pressure settled back onto his shoulders, heavier than before. "Maybe I should have just taken an IOU," he muttered to the empty car, his voice sounding hollow in the confined space. "I could have at least gotten his name, asked him to pay me back when he could." But even as the words left his mouth, Mark knew he wouldn't have done it differently. There had been something in the soldier's eyes, a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion, that had reached into Mark and touched something fundamental, something his father had carried home from Vietnam, a shadow that never quite left. Still, good intentions wouldn't pay the bills piling up on the kitchen counter. They wouldn't fix the transmission that groaned more loudly with each passing day. They wouldn't ease Sarah's worried frown when she thought he wasn't looking. As he turned onto his street, the houses dark and silent, Mark felt the doubt creep in like the chill from his faltering heater. His gesture might have meant something to the soldier, but what did it really accomplish? One free ride wouldn't change the man's life. It was just a drop in an ocean of indifference. The porch light was off when he pulled into his driveway. Sarah's gentle reminder that they needed to conserve electricity wherever possible. Mark killed the engine, sitting in sudden silence, broken only by the periodic tick of the cooling motor. His body ached with fatigue, muscles stiff from hours behind the wheel, but his mind raced with worries that sleep would not quiet. Inside, the house was still and dark. Mark moved through familiar spaces by memory, avoiding the creaky floorboard in the hallway, navigating around the corner of the coffee table that always seemed to find his shin. In the kitchen, bills lay spread across the table like fallen leaves, each one a commitment he struggled to honor. Mark set his keys beside them, the soft clink seeming to echo in the quiet house. Tomorrow would begin early, another long shift, another day of chasing fares and praying the old Crown Victoria would hold together for just a little longer. In the bedroom, Sarah slept soundly, her breathing deep and even. Mark slipped beneath the covers beside her, careful not to disturb her rest. She stirred slightly, murmuring something unintelligible before settling back into dreams. As exhaustion finally overcame worry, Mark's thoughts drifted back to the soldier. Standing alone in the rain, to the weight of that olive-green duffel bag, to the quiet "I won't forget it" that had followed him home. His eyelids grew heavy, the day's concerns blurring as sleep approached. His last conscious thought was of his father's voice from long ago. "Sometimes, son, the smallest kindnesses matter more than you'll ever know." Mark Evans drifted into sleep, unaware that his simple act of generosity had set in motion events that would soon transform his life in ways he could never have imagined. The taxi driver closed his eyes in one world and would wake to find himself in another. All because he had offered a free ride without a second thought. Mark's hand fumbled across the nightstand, knocking over a half-empty glass of water before finding his phone. The harsh ringtone cut through the early morning quiet, the screen showing 6:17 a.m. and an unfamiliar number with a Dover area code. Sarah stirred beside him, pulling the blanket over her head to shield against the intrusion. Outside, the world was still bathed in pre-dawn darkness, the sun not yet ready to announce the new day. Clearing his throat, Mark answered with a groggy, "Hello? Is this Mark Evans?" The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, carrying an unmistakable military cadence. The taxi driver from last night. Mark sat up straight, suddenly wide awake. His mind raced through possibilities. Had the passenger left something in his cab? Was there a complaint? Had something happened? Yes. "This is Mark," he confirmed, his voice still rough with sleep. "Who's calling?" "This is Staff Sergeant Wilson from Dover Air Force Base," the voice replied, maintaining its formal tone, but with an undercurrent of warmth. "I apologize for the early hour, but we have an urgent matter to discuss with you." Mark's pulse quickened. Dover Air Force Base, one of the largest military facilities on the East Coast. What could they possibly want with him? "Is everything all right?" Mark asked, glancing at Sarah, who had now propped herself up on one elbow, concern etched across her face. "Everything is fine, Mr. Evans," the sergeant assured him, "but we'd like to invite you to the base today. Would noon work for you?" Mark blinked in disbelief, certain he had misheard. "You want me to come to the base today?" "That's correct, sir. There's someone here who would like to meet you. The passenger from last night. But why the formal invitation? Why involve the Air Force?" Mark's mind spun with questions, none of which seemed to have reasonable answers. "May I ask what this is about?" Mark ventured, trying to keep his voice steady. There was a brief pause on the other end. "I'm afraid I can't discuss details over the phone, Mr. Evans, but I can assure you it's nothing to be concerned about. Quite the opposite, in fact." Sarah was fully awake now, mouthing, "What is it?" across the dim bedroom. Mark could only shake his head in bewilderment. "Noon today," the sergeant continued. "The main gate. You'll be expected and escorted from there. Can we count on your presence?" Mark thought of his shift, of the fares he would miss, of the bills on the kitchen table. But curiosity and something else, a strange feeling of anticipation, overrode his practical concerns. "Yes," he heard himself say. "I'll be there." "Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Evans. We'll see you." At noon, the call ended, leaving Mark staring at his phone in the half-light of dawn, questions tumbling through his mind like clothes in a dryer. What could the military possibly want with a taxi driver? How did they even get his number? Mark? Sarah's voice pulled him back to the present. "What's going on?" He turned to his wife, her face a mixture of curiosity and concern, and realized he had no adequate explanation to offer. "I'm not entirely sure," he admitted, the words feeling strange on his tongue. "But apparently I'm expected at Dover Air Force Base at noon today." The room felt suddenly charged with uncertainty, the familiar contours of their bedroom, unchanged yet somehow different, as if the phone call had altered the very air around them. Outside, the first hints of daylight began to creep across the horizon, the dawn of a day unlike any Mark Evans had experienced before. Whatever waited for him at Dover Air Force Base at noon would remain a mystery for the next few hours. But one thing was certain. His life was about to change in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. Mark's taxi crawled toward the imposing gates of Dover Air Force Base, the aging Crown Victoria seeming even more worn and out of place against the backdrop of military precision. Razor wire gleamed atop high fences, surveillance cameras tracked. His approach, and armed guards stood at attention, a world apart from the city streets he navigated daily. His palms dampened the steering wheel as he approached the checkpoint. Signs warned of restricted access and severe penalties for unauthorized entry. What was he doing here? A simple taxi driver with an invitation that seemed more surreal with each passing mile. Mark rolled down his window as a stern-faced guard approached, assault rifle slung across his chest, sunglasses masking his eyes. "ID, please," the guard requested, his voice clipped and professional. Mark fumbled for his driver's license, suddenly conscious of his civilian clothes, his unshaven face, the coffee stain on his shirt collar from the hasty cup he'd gulped down. Before leaving home, the guard examined the license, then checked a tablet. His expression remained unchanged, giving away nothing. "Mark Evans?" he confirmed. Mark nodded, tension building in his shoulders. "Yes, sir." To his surprise, the guard's demeanor softened slightly. "You're expected, Mr. Evans. Follow the green line painted on the road. Do not deviate from this path for any reason. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," Mark repeated, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. The massive gate slid open, revealing a vast military complex beyond. Mark guided his taxi through, following the green line as instructed, passing buildings labeled with codes rather than names, personnel moving with purpose in crisp uniforms, and aircraft in various stages of maintenance. The immensity of the operation, the order, the discipline, the resources, made his daily struggles seem small and distant. After several minutes, the green line led to a structure so massive it defied comprehension, a hangar large enough to house multiple commercial airliners. Two uniformed airmen flagged him down, directing him to a parking space marked with an orange cone. "Mr. Evans?" One approached as Mark stepped out, legs stiff from the drive. "Please follow me, sir." Inside the hangar, the temperature dropped. Several degrees, the air tinged with the scent of jet fuel and metal. Mark's footsteps echoed against the concrete floor as he followed his escort deeper into the cavernous space. Then he saw it. A C-5 Galaxy, one of the largest aircraft in the world, its grey bulk dominating the hangar like a sleeping giant. Personnel swarmed around it like ants, checking systems, loading equipment, preparing for departure. Near the massive nose of the aircraft stood a group of officers, their uniforms adorned with ribbons and insignia that spoke of rank and achievement. As Mark approached, guided by his escort, the group turned toward him. Mark's steps faltered as he recognized one face among them, the passenger from last night. But this was a transformation beyond comprehension. Gone was the exhausted man in rain-soaked civilian clothes. In his place stood a commanding officer, spine straight, shoulders squared, 4 silver stars gleaming on each shoulder of his immaculate uniform. The passenger, now revealed as a 4-star general, stepped forward, extending his hand. His eyes were the same, carrying the same depth, but now they held something new: respect. "Mr. Evans," he said, his voice carrying easily through the hangar, "thank you for coming. I believe we have some unfinished business." Mark stood frozen, his hand automatically reaching to meet the general's firm grip, his mind struggling to reconcile the solitary figure from the rainy airport with the high-ranking officer before him. Around them, the bustling activity of the hangar seemed to fade away, leaving only the echo of last night's simple interaction: a tired driver, a weary soldier, and a free ride that had somehow led him here. Mark stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the display of medals and ribbons adorning the chest of the man he'd driven to a budget motel just hours ago. The transformation was so complete, so astonishing, that for a moment he wondered if this was some elaborate case of mistaken identity. But those eyes, those same weary eyes that had met his in the rearview mirror, now gazed at him with unmistakable recognition. Though the exhaustion had been replaced with something warmer, more purposeful. The officer stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the concrete floor of the hangar. His uniform was pressed to perfection, the deep blue fabric a stark contrast to the rain-soaked civilian clothes from the night before. Silver wings gleamed above his breast pocket, catching the light with each movement. The insignia on his shoulders marked him as someone of significant rank, someone who commanded respect and authority. "Mr. Evans," he said, extending his hand, with a smile that transformed his entire face. "Lieutenant Colonel David Reynolds, C-5 Galaxy pilot, and I owe you a proper thank you." Mark's hand moved automatically to meet the colonel's firm grip, but words failed him. His mind raced to reconcile the rain-drenched passenger clutching a worn duffel bag with the distinguished officer who now stood before him. The disconnect was dizzying. You were just..." Mark stammered, gesturing vaguely toward the exit, as if pointing toward the Pinewood Motel miles away. Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds nodded, understanding the unfinished question. "Yes, I was. And you were the only cab driver willing to stop in that downpour." His voice carried easily through the cavernous space, confident yet humble. "More importantly, you were the only one who showed kindness without expecting anything in return." Mark's gaze drifted past the colonel to the enormous aircraft behind him, a machine designed to transport troops, vehicles, even other aircraft across continents and oceans. The man who had sat silently in his back seat, who had accepted a free ride with quiet gratitude, was responsible for piloting this behemoth through the skies. "I don't understand," Mark finally managed. "Why were you at a motel? Why not stay on base?" Something flickered across the colonel's face, a shadow of the weariness Mark had glimpsed the night before. 20-hour flight from Germany, multiple stops. "I just needed..." He paused, searching for the right words. "I needed a moment of anonymity, a breath before stepping back into uniform." Around them, airmen continued their preparations, their movements precise and coordinated. But Mark noticed how their eyes occasionally darted toward him and the colonel, curiosity evident in their glances. He was an outsider here, a civilian, in a world governed by rank and protocol. "I never imagined," Mark began, then stopped, unsure what he even meant to say. He never imagined giving a ride to a high-ranking officer, never imagined being summoned to an Air Force base, never imagined that his small gesture of kindness would be remembered at all. Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds seemed to understand the unfinished thought. His smile deepened, reaching his eyes in a way that softened the military bearing. "That's the beauty of kindness, Mr. Evans. You offered it freely, without knowing who I was, or what I might be able to do in return." He gestured toward the massive hangar, the personnel, the aircraft standing ready. In my position, people are often kind because of the rank, because of what they hope to gain. You were kind simply because you saw someone who needed help. Mark stood speechless beneath the soaring ceiling of the hangar, surrounded by the machinery of military might, facing a man who commanded both troops and aircraft, all because he had offered a free ride to a stranger in the rain. The enormity of the hangar seemed to shrink as Colonel Reynolds led Mark toward the waiting C-5 Galaxy, its massive frame dominating everything around it. Maintenance crews parted as they approached, offering respectful nods to the colonel while casting curious glances at the civilian in their midst. "I'd just returned from a 16-hour flight from Ramstein Air Base in Germany," Colonel Reynolds explained as they walked, his voice carrying a weight beyond fatigue. "Before that, 3 weeks of sensitive operations I can't discuss. I was completely drained, physically, mentally, emotionally." He paused at the foot of the boarding ramp, turning to face Mark directly. "When you picked me up, I'd been traveling for nearly 30 hours straight. I just needed a quiet place to decompress before reporting back." His eyes held Mark's with unexpected intensity. "Your kindness that night, it meant more than you realize." Mark stood silent, humbled by the revelation. He'd seen exhaustion in the man's face, yes, but had no way of knowing the full extent of what lay behind it. "I'd like to show you something if you're willing," Colonel Reynolds said, gesturing toward the aircraft's open cargo bay. "Not many civilians get to see this up close." The interior of the C-5 Galaxy unveiled itself like a cathedral of engineering. Cavernous space designed to transport tanks, helicopters, and supplies across continents. Mark's taxi could have fit inside multiple times over with room to spare. The ceiling arched high above them, lined with complex systems of hydraulics, wiring, and structural supports. "This aircraft can carry up to 135 tons of cargo," the colonel explained, his voice echoing in the vast space. "We've transported everything from disaster relief supplies to space shuttle components." As they moved through the plane, Colonel Reynolds pointed out features with the pride of someone showing off a beloved home. They climbed steep metal stairs to the upper deck, where the colonel led Mark into the cockpit, a complex array of instruments, displays, and controls spread before 6 crew positions. "This is where I spend most of my time," Reynolds said with a small smile. "Not quite as comfortable as your taxi." A young flight engineer looked up from her pre-flight checks, her surprise at seeing a civilian quickly masked by military professionalism. "Sir," she acknowledged the colonel before turning to Mark with curious eyes. "Lieutenant Cooper, this is Mark Evans," Colonel Reynolds introduced. "The man I was telling you about." Recognition flashed across her face. "The taxi driver? Sir, it's an honor." She extended her hand to Mark with unexpected deference. "The colonel told us what you did." Mark blinked in surprise. "I just gave someone a ride. You showed kindness to one of our own when he needed it most," she corrected gently. "That matters to all of us." As they continued the tour, crew members appeared at various stations, each greeting Mark with the same surprising respect. What had seemed a simple gesture to him clearly carried deeper meaning within these ranks. Near the end of the tour, they paused in a small briefing room adjacent to the crew quarters. An older officer with silver hair and weathered features approached, carrying something in his closed palm. "Mr. Evans," Colonel Reynolds said formally, "this is Major General Harkins, my commanding officer." The general nodded, opening his hand to reveal a gleaming medallion, an Air Force Challenge coin, its surface etched with emblems and mottos, its weight substantial in Mark's palm as it was pressed into his hand. "These aren't given lightly. Mr. Evans," the general said, his voice gravel rough but sincere. "They're a token of respect, a symbol that you're one of us in spirit, if not in uniform. Colonel Reynolds told me what you did and why." Mark stared at the coin, its metal cool. against his skin, its significance far outweighing its size. "I didn't do anything special," he said softly. Colonel Reynolds placed a hand on Mark's shoulder. "Sometimes, Mr. Evans, the most meaningful actions are the ones we think least significant. You saw a tired soldier and offered kindness without hesitation or expectation. That's something we value highly here." Mark stared at the folder placed before him, its blue cover embossed with the Air Force seal gleaming under the fluorescent lights of the briefing room. Colonel Reynolds stood across from him, hands clasped behind his back, waiting patiently, as Mark tried to process what he'd just heard. "I don't understand," Mark finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You want to hire me? My taxi?" Colonel Reynolds smiled, the expression warming his military bearing. "Not exactly. We're offering you a contractor position, Mr. Evans. Exclusive transport services for Dover Air Force Base personnel, pilots returning from missions, visiting officers, dignitaries who prefer discretion over fanfare." A woman in a crisp uniform, introduced earlier as Captain Daniels from personnel, stepped forward, opening the folder to reveal official letterhead and numbers that made Mark's eyes widen. "The position includes a base salary plus mileage compensation," she explained, her finger tracing down the page. "Health benefits, flexible scheduling, and security clearance to access the base directly." Mark's mind reeled. The figures before him represented more than double what he currently earned on his best months, with none of the uncertainty that came with chasing fares across the city. "Why me?" The question escaped before he could stop it, disbelief overwhelming his normally reserved nature. There must be dozens of more qualified drivers, younger ones with better vehicles. Colonel Reynolds exchanged a glance with Captain Daniels before moving closer, his voice lowering to a more personal tone. "Mr. Evans, may I speak candidly?" Mark nodded, still dazed. "Last night I was just another tired soldier to you. Not a lieutenant colonel, not a C-5 pilot, just someone who needed help." Reynolds gestured toward the massive aircraft visible through the window. "In my position, I rarely experience that kind of genuine interaction. People see the uniform, the rank. They don't see the person." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "When I checked my wallet at the motel and realized I had no cash, I was prepared for the usual reaction: frustration, suspicion, perhaps even anger. Instead, you showed compassion without hesitation. That speaks to your character, Mr. Evans." Mark's gaze drifted to the challenge coin now nestled in his palm, its weight somehow anchoring him to this surreal moment. "We need people like you," Colonel Reynolds continued. "People who understand service, who recognize the humanity beneath the uniform. Our personnel travel constantly, often returning exhausted from missions they can't discuss, carrying burdens they can't share. Having someone trustworthy to transport them, someone who gets it, that's invaluable." Captain Daniels cleared her throat gently. "There's also the matter of your background check, Mr. Evans. 20 years of safe driving, no criminal record, and multiple commendations from your taxi company for going above and beyond for passengers. You're exactly what we're looking for." They'd done research on him. The realization sent a strange mix of pride and humility through Mark's chest. "You didn't know who I was," Colonel Reynolds said quietly, "and yet you still helped me. We take care of people like that." Mark looked down at the contract again, at the promise of stability it represented. No more 16-hour shifts, no more wondering if he could cover rent, no more patching his car together with duct tape and prayers. He thought of Sarah, of Ellie's needed glasses, of Jason's college applications waiting on the kitchen table. He thought of his father, who would have understood the significance of this moment better than anyone. "I accept," Mark said, the words carrying a finality that seemed to shift something fundamental in the air around him. "Thank you," as he signed, his name on the dotted line. Mark Evans marveled at how life could change in an instant, how a simple act of kindness offered to a stranger in the rain had somehow opened a door he never knew existed, leading him to a future brighter than he'd dared to imagine. Mark Evans guided his taxi through the gates of Dover Air Force Base, watched as they closed behind him in the rear-view mirror, a symbolic threshold between his old life and whatever lay ahead. The security guard, who had scrutinized him with suspicion just hours before now, offered a respectful nod as he passed. The concrete barriers and razor wire receded, but the weight of the signed contract in his jacket pocket remained, solid and real, more substantial than the challenge coin that now rested in his palm as he paused at a red light, turning the metal emblem over and over with his thumb. 24 hours ago, he had been a taxi driver with a failing transmission and mounting bills. Now, he was a contractor for the United States Air Force with steady income, benefits, and purpose, all because he had offered a free ride to a stranger in the rain. Traffic flowed around him as he merged onto the highway, other drivers unaware of the transformation that had occurred in the aging Crown Victoria beside them. Mark's mind replayed the morning's events in a continuous loop. The massive hangar, the towering C-5, the cockpit with its dizzying array of instruments, and most of all, the respect in Colonel Reynolds' eyes when he had said, "We take care of people like that." His phone rang through the car speakers, Sarah's name appearing on the screen. "Mark, what happened? Are you okay?" Her voice carried the worry of hours without explanation. "I'm fine," he assured her, a smile spreading across his face. "Better than fine, actually. I have so much to tell you." "You're scaring me a little," she admitted. "What's going on?" Mark took a deep breath, watching the horizon stretch before him, wider and more full of possibility than it had seemed in years. "That passenger last night, the one I gave the free ride to." He paused, still processing the reality himself. He was an Air Force lieutenant colonel, a C-5 pilot. And they just offered me a job, Sarah, a real job with benefits, driving for the base. The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds before Sarah's voice returned, thick with emotion. "Because you gave him a free ride?" "Because I didn't know who he was, and I helped him anyway," Mark corrected gently, echoing the colonel's words. "Apparently that matters more than I realized." The highway stretched before him, bathed in afternoon sunlight that seemed brighter somehow, more laden with promise. In his mind, Mark could still hear his father's voice from long ago. "Sometimes, son, the smallest kindnesses matter more than you'll ever know." How right he had been. One moment of generosity, one decision to help rather than demand payment had altered the trajectory of their lives in ways he could never have predicted. As Mark drove toward home, toward a future suddenly rich with possibility, he understood a truth both simple and profound. We never truly know the ripple effects of our actions, the doors that might open because of a kindness freely given, the lives that might change, including our own, because we chose compassion over calculation. Small acts of kindness can lead to life-changing moments. A hand extended without expectation of return, a moment of humanity shared between strangers. These are the invisible threads that bind us together, that remind us we are never truly alone in our struggles. Do you believe in the power of generosity? Comment 1 if you do. The taxi continued down the highway, carrying a man transformed not by the contract in his pocket, but by the realization that had been there all along. In a world that often measures value in dollars and cents, the most valuable currency remains kindness freely given. Subscribe for more incredible real-life stories that prove kindness always comes back. Because in the end, it's not what we gain, but what we give that defines us. And sometimes in the giving, we receive more than we ever imagined possible.